They say a person's heart rarely changes all at once. Sometimes it begins with nothing more than a glance at 8 o'clock on an ordinary evening. The antique grandfather clock standing in the center of the Moretti mansion released 8 slow chimes that echoed through the marble halls with quiet elegance. Every member of the household knew what those chimes meant. The day's responsibilities were nearly finished, the meetings were over, the guests had departed, and the enormous estate gradually settled into its familiar nighttime calm. Ethan Moretti remained inside his private study, reviewing contracts spread neatly across a polished walnut desk. At 38, the white mafia boss had built his reputation on discipline so absolute that even the smallest interruption rarely pulled his attention away from work. His perfectly tailored charcoal suit still looked untouched despite another 14-hour day. Beside him, a crystal glass of sparkling water remained almost full, forgotten as he carefully read another page. Outside the study, footsteps crossed the hallway with their usual quiet rhythm. Ethan recognized them without looking up. They belonged to Ava Brooks. For nearly 2 years, the young Black Maid had become part of the mansion's daily rhythm. Every morning, she opened the curtains before sunrise. Every afternoon, she arranged fresh flowers throughout the estate. Every evening, she quietly checked that every room looked exactly as it should before leaving for the night. Ethan had never considered how naturally her presence had blended into the life of the mansion. She was simply always there, moving gracefully through the background without asking for recognition. The final page of the contract slid beneath Ethan's pen as he signed his name with practiced precision. He leaned back for the first time all evening and glanced toward the hallway, just as Ava stepped into view. For a brief moment, he almost failed to recognize her. She was no longer wearing the familiar Navy housekeeping uniform. Instead, she wore a simple light blue dress that reached just below her knees, paired with modest heels and a small silver necklace that caught the warm glow of the chandelier above. Her natural curls rested neatly over one shoulder, and a gentle smile softened her face in a way Ethan had never noticed before. There was nothing extravagant about her appearance, nothing designed to attract attention, yet somehow the quiet elegance suited her perfectly. Ethan lowered the document without realizing he had stopped reading halfway through the final sentence. Ava paused near the entrance table, checking the time on her phone before placing her employee badge into her handbag. She looked both excited and nervous, taking a slow breath before smoothing the fabric of her dress with her hands. One of the older housekeepers happened to pass by and smiled warmly. "You look beautiful tonight, Ava." Ava laughed softly, her voice carrying genuine happiness instead of embarrassment. "Thank you. I almost changed my mind 3 times. The older woman chuckled. "Do not keep the poor man waiting." Ava smiled again before walking toward the front entrance. Ethan quietly stood from his chair without fully understanding why. He rarely paid attention to the personal lives of employees. It had never seemed appropriate. Yet something about this evening felt strangely different. He stepped into the hallway just as the butler opened the front door. Cool evening air drifted inside, carrying the scent of freshly cut roses from the gardens. Ava turned toward the doorway, then noticed Ethan standing several feet away. She smiled politely, the same respectful smile she always offered. "Good evening, Mr. Moretti." Ethan returned the greeting almost automatically. His eyes rested on the blue dress for another silent second before he heard himself asking a question he had never expected to ask. "Going somewhere?" For a brief moment, Ava Brooks simply smiled, almost as though she had not expected the question to come from him. The warm light spilling from the grand chandelier reflected softly in her eyes as she adjusted the thin strap of her handbag. "Yes, sir," she answered politely. "I am meeting someone for dinner." Ethan Moretti remained standing beside the doorway of his study, one hand still resting against the leather folder he had been carrying only moments earlier. The answer itself was ordinary. There was nothing unusual about an employee spending an evening with friends or going on a date. Yet the simple sentence lingered in the quiet hallway far longer than it should have. "A date?" he heard himself ask before realizing the question had already escaped his lips. Ava gave a small, slightly embarrassed laugh. "Yes, sir." She lowered her eyes for a second before looking back up with quiet honesty. "It is actually my first real date in a very long time." Ethan nodded once. "I see." Neither of them spoke again for several seconds. Somewhere deeper inside the mansion, Dishes were being arranged in the kitchen, while a distant piano melody floated softly from the music room, where one of the younger staff members often practiced after work. Everything continued exactly as it always had, yet the silence between them somehow felt entirely different. Ava glanced toward the front entrance where the butler patiently held the door open. I should probably go before I make him wait. Ethan looked toward the front drive where a modest blue sedan had just pulled to the front gate. Through the windshield, he could barely make out the silhouette of a young man waiting respectfully inside the car. There was nothing remarkable about him. No luxury vehicle. No expensive suit. Just someone arriving on time with quiet patience. Ava smiled warmly. Have a good evening, Mr. Moretti. You as well, Ethan replied almost automatically. She stepped through the doorway and into the cool evening air. The front door closed gently behind her with little more than a soft click. Somehow that small sound echoed through the enormous mansion more loudly than any conversation from earlier that day. Ethan remained standing exactly where he was. The hallway suddenly felt unusually empty. He slowly walked toward the tall front windows overlooking the circular driveway, just in time to see Ava greet the young man. They exchanged friendly smiles before he opened the passenger door for her. She thanked him, climbed inside, and the car quietly disappeared beyond the front gates. Ethan continued watching long after the taillights vanished into the distance. He could not explain why. He had approved vacations, promotions, retirements, and resignations without ever becoming emotionally involved in the personal lives of those who worked for him. Professional distance had always been one of his unwritten rules. It kept expectations clear and emotions uncomplicated. Yet tonight something had shifted so subtly that he could not even identify the exact moment it happened. Perhaps it had been the blue dress. Perhaps it had been the smile she wore when she mentioned the date. Or perhaps it was the realization that he knew almost everything about how Ava cared for his home, but almost nothing about the life she returned to every evening after leaving it. He quietly returned to his study and sat behind the massive walnut desk. The unsigned contracts remained exactly where he had left them. He picked up his pen, read the first paragraph again, then realized he had reached the end of the page without understanding a single sentence. He set the pen back down. Across the room, the antique clock continued measuring the evening with calm precision. 8:15, 8:20, 8:27. Ethan looked toward the hallway almost without thinking, as though expecting to hear Ava's familiar footsteps returning with a basket of fresh linens or a vase of flowers. The hallway remained silent. For the first time in many years, the mansion did not feel larger because it was quiet. It felt larger because someone unexpectedly important was no longer inside it. The evening unfolded with remarkable slowness after Ava Brooks left the estate. Ethan Moretti had always believed that time obeyed discipline. Meetings began on schedule. Decisions were made without hesitation. Every hour inside the mansion served a purpose. Yet that night, the hands of the antique clock seemed determined to move more slowly than ever before. He reached for another contract, carefully reviewed the first paragraph, signed the final page, then glanced toward the hallway almost without realizing he had done it again. Nothing. The corridor remained perfectly still beneath the soft golden lights. Ethan quietly leaned back in his chair and closed the folder. For reasons he could not explain, the mansion sounded different. It was not louder or quieter. It simply felt as though something essential had stepped outside with Ava. Across town, Ava sat inside a cozy neighborhood Italian restaurant tucked between an old bookstore and a family-owned bakery. Warm string lights hung above the windows, and soft jazz drifted through the dining room. Her date, Daniel Foster, greeted her with an easy smile and pulled out her chair before sitting across from her. He worked as an elementary school teacher, someone she had met through a mutual friend several weeks earlier. Their conversations over the phone had been pleasant, respectful, and refreshingly simple. Tonight was their first opportunity to meet in person. Ava felt nervous but hopeful. For years, her life had revolved around work. She rarely accepted invitations and almost never made time for herself. This evening felt like a quiet promise that life might finally include something beyond responsibility. Daniel asked about her favorite books, her childhood in Atlanta, and the flowers she enjoyed arranging throughout the mansion. Ava answered with genuine warmth, occasionally laughing in a way her co-workers rarely had the chance to hear. Meanwhile, Ethan walked through the library without opening a single book. He paused beside the grand piano in the music room before continuing toward the dining hall, where a perfectly prepared dinner waited untouched beneath polished silver covers. The chef approached respectfully. "Would you like your meal served now, sir?" Ethan looked at the table set for one before quietly shaking his head. "Not yet." The chef nodded and disappeared back into the kitchen. Ethan realized he was not hungry. Instead, he wandered onto the covered terrace overlooking the gardens. A cool breeze carried the scent of roses and freshly cut grass through the evening air. Countless evenings had passed exactly this way. Yet tonight, every familiar place reminded him of Ava in small, unexpected ways. The roses she carefully trimmed every Thursday. The lanterns she polished before every formal gathering. The cushions she arranged before sunrise whenever rain had fallen during the night. He had never noticed how much of the mansion quietly reflected her care until she was absent from it. Back at the restaurant, Daniel listened attentively while Ava described her late grandmother, the woman who had taught her that every room deserved kindness because someone would eventually walk into it carrying burdens nobody else could see. Daniel smiled. "That explains why you sound grateful even when you talk about hard work." Ava looked down at her glass before answering. "I have been fortunate to meet people who taught me that dignity is something you bring with you. It does not depend on the job you have." Hundreds of feet away inside the mansion, Ethan found himself standing outside the flower room where fresh arrangements waited for the next morning. He noticed one unfinished bouquet resting beside an empty vase. Without thinking, he adjusted a single white lily that had begun leaning slightly to one side. After a quiet moment, he almost smiled. It was not arranged nearly as beautifully as Ava would have done it. He stepped back, looked at the imperfect bouquet, and for the first time in years admitted something to himself that no business strategy, no carefully planned schedule, and no position of authority had prepared him to understand. He was not simply waiting for an employee to return. He was waiting for one particular person. The evening continued exactly as Ava Brooks had hoped, quiet, comfortable, and free from unnecessary expectations. Daniel Foster listened more than he spoke, and for the first half hour she found that refreshing. They shared a simple pasta dinner, exchanged stories about childhood memories, favorite neighborhoods, and the small traditions that had shaped their lives. Every answer came naturally, and Ava gradually relaxed enough to forget how nervous she had felt before arriving. Then, almost without warning, the conversation slowly changed. Daniel began talking more about himself than about the person sitting across from him. He described his career plans in careful detail, the larger apartment he hoped to rent next year, the promotions he wanted, and the image he hoped to build for his future. Ava listened politely, nodding with genuine interest, but she noticed something she had learned to recognize after years of quietly observing people. Whenever she shared something personal, Daniel quickly redirected the conversation back to himself. He never interrupted her rudely. He simply never stayed with her stories long enough to understand them. When she mentioned how much she enjoyed arranging flowers because her grandmother believed beauty could comfort tired hearts, Daniel smiled politely before immediately changing the subject to expensive restaurants he wanted to visit one day. When Ava spoke about volunteering at a neighborhood community center on occasional weekends, Daniel responded by describing how busy his own schedule had become. Nothing he said was unkind. Nothing was disrespectful. Yet by the time dessert arrived, Ava quietly realized something important. Daniel liked having someone across the table. He had never really become curious about the woman sitting there. She stirred her tea thoughtfully while watching families laugh together near the front windows of the restaurant. She had spent years believing that finding time for herself would automatically lead to happiness. Tonight gently reminded her that sharing time only mattered when both people truly listened. Daniel eventually checked his watch and smiled. "I know a rooftop lounge a few blocks away if you would like to keep the evening going." Ava returned his smile with sincere kindness. "That is thoughtful, but I think I am going to head home tonight." He looked mildly surprised. "Everything all right?" She nodded. "Everything is perfectly all right. I just think tonight helped me realize I've been looking for something a little different." Daniel accepted her answer with quiet respect. "I understand." He walked her to the entrance, thanked her for dinner, and wished her a safe trip home. They parted with genuine goodwill, knowing neither had done anything wrong. Sometimes two kind people simply wanted different things from life. Nearly an hour away, Ethan Moretti remained awake inside the mansion. Several business associates had called during the evening, but he postponed each conversation until the following morning. He wandered through rooms that suddenly felt unfamiliar despite having lived there for years. The library seemed too quiet. The dining hall too large. Even the freshly polished staircase reflected light differently, without Ava's cheerful greeting somewhere nearby. Shortly before midnight, Ethan walked into the kitchen for a glass of water. One of the night staff smiled politely. Miss Brooks left fresh bread in the warming drawer before she went out. She said you usually forget to eat when you are working late. Ethan paused with his hand resting against the counter. He quietly opened the warming drawer and found a neatly folded kitchen towel covering a small loaf of homemade rosemary bread she had baked that afternoon with the chef. Beside it rested a handwritten note in careful script. Please remember to eat before midnight. Have a peaceful evening. Ethan stood silently holding the note for several long moments. The mansion had always felt perfectly organized because Ava quietly thought about everyone else before thinking about herself. Only now, in her absence, did he begin to understand how deeply those simple acts of kindness had become woven into the rhythm of his own life. The grandfather clock quietly announced 11:30 with a series of slow chimes that drifted through the sleeping mansion. Ethan Moretti remained seated in the living room instead of returning to his study. A book rested unopened on the coffee table beside him, and the cup of tea the kitchen staff had prepared nearly an hour earlier had already grown cold. He rarely spent time waiting for anyone. Throughout his life, people had waited for him. Tonight, however, he found himself listening for the sound of tires crossing the gravel driveway. Every few minutes his eyes lifted toward the tall windows overlooking the front entrance before settling back on the silent room. He still held Ava's handwritten note inside the pocket of his suit jacket without fully understanding why he had not left it on the kitchen counter. Across the city, Ava Brooks sat quietly inside the rideshare vehicle taking her home. Streetlights passed across the windows in soft golden streaks while she reflected on the evening. She did not feel disappointed. In many ways, she felt grateful. Daniel had been respectful, thoughtful, and sincere in his own way. Their conversation had simply helped her recognize something she had never been able to describe before. She was not searching for someone who could impress her with plans or achievements. She longed for someone who noticed the little things. Someone who remembered how she took her tea, asked how her day had truly been, or appreciated the quiet acts of kindness that often went unnoticed. Those were the gestures that made people feel seen. She smiled gently as she looked out the window, realizing that the evening had taught her more about herself than about the man she had met. Just before midnight, the front gates of the Moretti estate slowly opened. Ethan heard the distant sound of a vehicle approaching before the headlights swept across the front garden. He stood almost immediately, surprised by how quickly his body reacted. The car came to a smooth stop beneath the entrance canopy, and the driver stepped out to open the rear passenger door. Ava thanked him warmly before gathering her small handbag and walking toward the front entrance. She looked peaceful rather than excited, thoughtful rather than disappointed. As the front door opened, she seemed genuinely surprised to find Ethan standing in the foyer. "Mr. Moretti," she said softly, "you are still awake." Ethan offered a faint smile. Apparently so. Neither of them moved for a brief moment. The mansion felt unusually quiet, wrapped in the calm that only arrives after midnight. Ava noticed the untouched book resting on the nearby table and the half-finished cup of tea. "Were you working late again?" she asked. Ethan glanced toward the cup before answering honestly. "I tried." Ava smiled knowingly. "You forgot to eat, did you not?" Ethan reached into his jacket pocket and carefully unfolded the small handwritten note she had left beside the bread. "Actually, someone reminded me." Ava laughed softly, the sound warm enough to brighten the silent foyer. "I am glad." Ethan looked at her for a long second before speaking again. "How was your evening?" Ava considered the question carefully. "It was good," she answered. "Not because everything was perfect. Sometimes an evening can still be valuable even when it teaches you that someone is simply not the right person." Ethan quietly absorbed her words. There was no sadness in her voice, only calm acceptance. For reasons he could not explain, he felt unexpectedly relieved. He immediately questioned that feeling. Relief made no logical sense. Ava's happiness should have been the only thing that mattered. Yet as she stood there smiling beneath the soft chandelier light, Ethan realized that the emptiness he had carried through the evening had disappeared the moment she walked back through the front door. Neither of them noticed that the antique clock had quietly begun counting the first minutes of a brand new day, while something neither of them had planned slowly began changing inside both their hearts. Morning sunlight poured through the tall windows of the Moretti mansion, painting long golden lines across the marble floors that Ava Brooks had polished hundreds of times before. At first glance, everything appeared exactly as it always had. The kitchen staff prepared breakfast with practiced precision. Gardeners trimmed the hedges outside. Security personnel quietly rotated shifts at the front entrance. Yet beneath the familiar routine, something subtle had changed. Ethan Moretti noticed it almost immediately. As he entered the dining room, Ava was placing a fresh arrangement of white lilies and pale blue hydrangeas at the center of the long table. She worked with the same calm focus she always carried, carefully turning the vase a few inches until every flower faced the morning light. Ethan paused without announcing himself. He had walked past scenes like this countless times during the past 2 years without giving them more than a passing glance. Today he watched for nearly a full minute before speaking. "Good morning, Ava." She turned with a warm smile that reached her eyes. "Good morning, Mr. Moretti. I hope you slept well." Ethan considered the question before answering honestly. "Better than expected." Ava smiled softly. "I am. Glad." As she prepared to continue toward the next room, Ethan noticed she carried 2 heavy storage boxes filled with folded table linens. Before she could adjust her grip, he stepped forward and lifted one of the boxes himself. Ava blinked with quiet surprise. "Sir, you do not have to do that." Ethan looked at the box as though the answer were obvious. "I know, but I can." Together they walked toward the linen room, neither of them speaking for several moments. The silence no longer felt formal. It felt comfortable. Along the hallway they passed several members of the household staff, each one discreetly pretending not to notice that the owner of the estate was carrying supplies beside his housekeeper. Ethan paid no attention to their surprised expressions. He simply placed the box on the storage shelf and thanked Ava for organizing everything so carefully. The words came naturally, yet Ava stood still for a brief second after he left, quietly absorbing something she had rarely experienced. Gratitude offered without obligation. Throughout the following days, the changes remained small enough that an outsider might never have noticed them. Ethan no longer walked past staff members without greeting them. He learned the names of employees who had worked inside the mansion for years. During breakfast meetings, he thanked the chef before discussing business. He asked the gardeners how the roses were recovering after a week of heavy rain. Whenever Ava prepared fresh flowers, he paused to admire the arrangements instead of rushing past them. None of these gestures required money, authority, or influence. They required only attention. Ava noticed every one of them. She never mentioned the evening of her date, and Ethan never asked about Daniel again. Somehow there was no need. The conversation they had shared after midnight had quietly changed the rhythm between them. One afternoon, while arranging books inside the library, Ava accidentally dropped a small framed photograph that had been sitting unnoticed on a high shelf. She immediately bent down to pick it up, relieved to discover the glass had not broken. The picture showed Ethan many years earlier standing beside an elderly woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile. Ethan entered the library just as Ava carefully wiped away a small trace of dust from the frame. "I am sorry," she said. "It slipped while I was cleaning." Ethan accepted the photograph and looked at it for several quiet seconds. "That was my grandmother," he said softly. "She used to tell me that the character of a home is revealed by how people treat those who expect nothing in return." Ava smiled gently. "She sounds like someone I would have enjoyed meeting." Ethan looked from the photograph to Ava, and for the first time he understood that his grandmother would have admired the woman standing before him far more than any accomplishment or fortune he had ever built. That realization stayed with him long after the conversation ended, quietly guiding every choice he would make from that day forward. Nearly 3 weeks passed, and the Moretti mansion settled into a new rhythm that nobody had planned, yet everyone quietly accepted. Nothing dramatic happened. There were no grand announcements, no whispered rumors, and no sudden confessions. Instead, the smallest moments slowly became the ones that mattered most. Ethan Moretti continued leading his business with the same discipline that had earned him respect for years, but those who worked inside the estate noticed subtle differences that could not be measured on schedules or financial reports. Every morning, he greeted the household staff by name before beginning his meetings. Every afternoon, he thanked the chef before leaving the dining room. Every evening, if he happened to cross paths with Ava Brooks, he paused long enough to ask how her day had been instead of simply walking past. The questions were never complicated, yet Ava realized something unusual. Ethan always listened to the answer. One rainy afternoon, the estate lost power for several minutes after a severe thunderstorm passed through the neighborhood. Emergency lights softly illuminated the hallways while maintenance crews checked the backup generators outside. The interruption was brief, but it brought the entire household together inside the main sitting room while everyone waited for the electricity to return. Candles were placed across the tables, filling the room with a warm golden glow that reminded Ava of evenings spent at her grandmother's house. Some staff members quietly talked among themselves while others simply enjoyed the unexpected pause from work. Ethan entered carrying a tray with mugs of hot chocolate prepared by the kitchen staff. Without ceremony, he began handing them to everyone in the room, starting with the housekeepers, gardeners, and maintenance workers before taking one for himself. Several employees exchanged surprised smiles. They had never seen the owner of the estate serve anyone before. When Ethan reached Ava, he handed her the final mug. "I remembered you prefer extra cinnamon," he said. Ava looked down at the steaming cup before smiling with quiet amazement. "You remembered that?" Ethan nodded naturally. "You mentioned it once last winter." Ava wrapped both hands around the warm mug, touched not by the drink itself, but by the fact that he had remembered something so small after all those months. The lights returned only a minute later, yet nobody rushed to leave. The room somehow felt warmer than before the electricity had failed. As the staff gradually returned to their responsibilities, the head gardener quietly approached Ethan. "Sir," he said with a respectful smile, "this place feels different these days." Ethan looked toward the hallway where Ava was laughing gently with two younger housekeepers about a crooked candle that refused to stand straight. "Does it?" The gardener nodded. "People work harder when they feel noticed." Ethan remained silent after the gardener walked away. Those simple words stayed with him for the rest of the afternoon. Later that evening, Ethan passed through the greenhouse where Ava was trimming fresh lavender for the guest rooms. The soft scent filled the warm air, while rainwater still glistened on the glass roof above them. Neither of them spoke immediately. They had grown comfortable sharing quiet moments without feeling the need to fill every silence. Finally, Ethan looked toward the rows of flowers stretching across the room. "You once told me that beauty can comfort tired hearts." Ava smiled while gently tying the lavender stems together with a thin ribbon. "My grandmother believed every home should have at least one thing that reminds people to slow down." Ethan looked at the bundle of lavender in her hands before quietly answering. "I think she was right." Ava met his eyes for only a second before returning to her work, but in that brief glance both of them understood that something far more meaningful than admiration had begun taking root. It had not grown from excitement or grand gestures. It had grown from ordinary kindness repeated often enough to become trust, and from trust quietly becoming something neither of them was ready to name. Autumn arrived quietly, bringing cooler evenings and crisp air that carried the scent of fallen leaves through the gardens surrounding the Moretti estate. The mansion remained as elegant as ever, yet those who lived and worked there had begun measuring time differently. Instead of remembering important days by business meetings or formal dinners, many now remembered them through the small moments that unfolded naturally between Ethan Moretti and Ava Brooks. Neither of them acknowledged the quiet change aloud, but everyone else could see it growing one ordinary day at a time. One Saturday afternoon, the staff gathered in the courtyard to prepare for the annual charity dinner the estate hosted for local teachers, firefighters, nurses, and community volunteers. Decorations covered long wooden tables while fresh flowers arrived by the truckload. Ava carefully directed the placement of every arrangement, making sure each centerpiece reflected the warm colors of the season. Ethan spent the morning reviewing event details, but every time he crossed the courtyard, his attention drifted toward Ava without conscious effort. He admired the way she encouraged younger employees with patience, thanked every delivery driver personally, and quietly fixed problems before anyone else even noticed them. She never sought praise. She simply believed that every person deserved to feel welcomed. As the afternoon sun settled lower across the gardens, One of the younger house box of delicate glass candle holders. Several pieces rolled across the stone walkway. The young employee immediately looked overwhelmed, apologizing repeatedly with tears beginning to form in her eyes. Before anyone else could respond, Ava knelt beside her with a reassuring smile. "It is all right," she said gently. "We can replace glass. We cannot replace peace of mind. Let us clean this up together." Ethan watched the scene from only a few feet away. He noticed that Ava never asked who was responsible. She never raised her voice. She simply protected another person's dignity before worrying about the decorations. Without hesitation, Ethan walked over, picked up the empty box, and quietly helped gather the remaining unbroken candle holders. Several staff members exchanged surprised glances. No one expected the owner of the estate to kneel on the stone walkway beside them. When everything had been cleaned, the nervous housekeeper whispered, "Thank you." Ava smiled warmly. One difficult moment does not define your whole day. Ethan looked at the young employee and nodded in agreement. Nor does one mistake define your value. The words surprised even him as they left his mouth, yet he realized they were true. Later that evening, after the guests had departed and the last tables had been cleared, Ethan found Ava standing alone beneath strings of softly glowing lights in the garden courtyard. She was carefully placing the remaining flowers into baskets so they could be donated to a nearby senior living center the following morning instead of being thrown away. Ethan approached slowly, watching her gently rearrange each bouquet so every basket looked equally beautiful. "You always think about what happens after everyone else leaves," he said quietly. Ava smiled without looking up. Beauty should not be wasted simply because the event is over. Ethan stood beside her in comfortable silence before asking, "Did you ever think about going on another date with Daniel?" Ava paused for only a moment before gently shaking her head. No. Ethan did not ask why. He simply waited. After tying one final ribbon around a basket, Ava finally looked at him. "He was a good man," she said honestly, "but I realized I was searching for someone who notices people before noticing appearances, who values kindness before accomplishments, and who makes others feel important without trying to impress them." Ethan lowered his eyes for a brief second, quietly recognizing that the man she had just described was not the man he had been a few months earlier. Yet somewhere along the way, because of her quiet example, he had slowly become someone much closer to that person than he had ever imagined possible. Several weeks later, the familiar grandfather clock once again prepared to announce 8 o'clock. The same warm lights filled the marble hallways. The same evening breeze drifted through the open windows, and the Moretti mansion carried the quiet elegance it always had. Yet no one inside the estate was quite the same as they had been before. Ethan Moretti stood near the front entrance holding a single navy blue dinner reservation envelope in one hand. He had spent the entire afternoon reviewing it, folding it closed, opening it again, and wondering whether there would ever be a perfect moment. Eventually, he realized that some conversations did not become easier by waiting. Across the hallway, Ava Brooks finished placing the final vase of fresh flowers near the staircase before removing her gardening gloves. She looked around one last time, making certain every room felt welcoming before ending another day of work. As she turned toward the staff hallway, Ethan quietly called her name. "Ava." She looked back with the same warm smile that had greeted him every morning for months. "Yes, Mr. Moretti." Ethan walked toward her without rushing. There was no audience, no formal gathering, and no dramatic music. Only the soft ticking of the grandfather clock and the peaceful silence of a home that had witnessed countless ordinary moments quietly becoming extraordinary. He stopped a respectful distance away. "May I ask you something?" Ava nodded. "Of course." Ethan looked down briefly before meeting her eyes again. "Do you remember the evening you left for dinner a few months ago?" Ava laughed softly. "I do." Ethan smiled. "That was the first time I realized this house felt different whenever you were not here." Ava listened without interrupting. Ethan continued carefully, choosing every word with the same thoughtfulness he now tried to bring into every conversation. "At first I believed I simply appreciated your work. Then I realized it was much more than that. You taught me to notice people before titles, kindness before accomplishments, and quiet acts of care before impressive achievements. You changed this home without asking anyone to change. Somewhere along the way, you changed me too." Ava's eyes reflected quiet emotion, yet she remained peacefully composed. Ethan slowly held out the envelope. There is a small family-owned restaurant overlooking the river. I made a reservation for tomorrow evening. He paused before adding the words that mattered most. Not because you work here. Not because I expect anything in return. I simply hoped that if you were comfortable, you might allow me to take you to dinner as Ethan. Ava accepted the envelope without opening it immediately. She looked at him for a long moment, searching not for confidence or status, but for sincerity. What she found was the same quiet kindness he had spent months learning one ordinary day at a time. A gentle smile slowly appeared across her face. I would like that, she answered. The grandfather clock began striking 8, each chime filling the hallway with familiar warmth. Neither of them spoke while the final note echoed through the mansion. There was no need. The answer had already been given. Outside, the evening breeze gently stirred the white roses lining the front walkway, while inside, the flowers Ava had arranged earlier caught the last golden light of the setting sun. The mansion had not become a place where power discovered love. It had become a place where respect quietly grew into trust. Trust patiently became friendship, and friendship finally found the courage to become something more. Long after the lights dimmed and another ordinary day came to an end, the people who lived and worked inside those walls would remember that lasting relationships are rarely built through grand promises. They begin with simple kindness, patient attention, and the willingness to truly see another person. And on one quiet evening, when the clock reached 8 once again, two lives stepped forward not because destiny demanded it, but because respect had already prepared the way.